Good day. The talks in Geneva have now taken place between the Americans and the Russians, and I think this is perhaps a good moment for me to provide a brief summary of, I think, what happened, and also perhaps to explain how we got to this point. Now, I should say that one can take time passing through the various press conferences and comments made by Ryabkov and Wendy Sherman, the two lead negotiators, but I don't think that's strictly necessary. And as I'm a bit pressed for time today, I'm not going to do it. Briefly, it seems to me that to understand where we are, we have to go back to the situation at the start of this year. It began, as many of you will recall, with a large-scale deployment of Ukrainian forces to the contact line and with all sorts of belligerent comments made from Ukraine, all of which gave a clear impression that the Ukrainians were about to launch an attack on the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. As we now know, all of this was happening in parallel with what appear to have been attempts to organize or stage some kind of coup attempt in neighboring Belarus. Well, whatever those plans were and however they were intended, and I suspect that part of the plan was not so much to attack and try to occupy the Donbass, but more to pressure the Russians into direct negotiations with the Ukrainians, into a meeting between Zelensky and Putin, in which Putin would in effect admit that Russia was a party to the conflict and agree a settlement of the conflict with Zelensky on US and Ukrainian lines. Well, instead of that happening, what happened was that the Russians were able to squelch the coup in Belarus, obviously in tandem with Belarus's own special services, and they were able to take, or rather they assembled in very short order, a very large, powerful strike force in European Russia, which was clearly poised to respond in the event that there was a Ukrainian offensive in the Donbass. And of course that created a situation where the West and the Ukrainians had to try to defuse the situation because everybody can do the sums, and it became fairly clear fairly quickly that in the event of such a war, Ukraine would be quickly defeated and, as the Russians said, would in effect be destroyed. Well, what then happened over the course of the summer is that somebody in Washington seems to have realized that though the Russian troops did return by and large to their barracks after the initial crisis in the spring and early summer was diffused, the Russians nonetheless continued to build up their military infrastructure in European Russia. And apparently this is an ongoing process. Large numbers of troops, logistics, infrastructure are being positioned there, not in any way that suggests an imminent plan to attack Ukraine, but rather as part of some kind of plan to try to deter the Ukrainians from launching such an attack. Well, the build-up of Russian forces in European Russia became then a major issue in the United States. A group of people, probably in the State Department, decided to make a big play about this and to talk up some kind of enormous Russian threat to Ukraine. Presumably, the intention was to try to get the Russians to pull some of these troops back or to stop building up this infrastructure, or perhaps it's conceivable, given how paranoid sometimes these people are, that they really did begin to worry that there was some sort of genuine threat to Ukraine from this build-up, this incremental build-up. So the result was a steady escalation in the war of words and the atmosphere of tension over the course of the autumn. There were a succession of unsuccessful visits by US diplomats, by Victoria Nuland, by a CIA director Burns, by Karen Dornfield, to Moscow to try to get the Russians to start to ramp down this build-up, all of which, of course, the Russians declined to do. But in the midst of this escalation, the Russians were able to turn the situation round to their advantage by saying that the reason tension was increasing was because of this push to integrate Ukraine into NATO, and that they now seek legally binding security guarantees, not just stopping further NATO expansion, but in effect reversing it by getting NATO to withdraw all its military infrastructure from Eastern Europe. And what then followed is that there was supposed to be a high noon summit meeting between Putin and Biden, in which, from what one can gather, Biden was supposed to intimidate and frighten Putin by raising all sorts of threats of sanctions if the Russians didn't fall into line, didn't start a process of de-escalation. But again, the Russians turned that to their advantage by getting Biden to agree to talks which I think many people in NATO and in the United States now think were a serious mistake, but talks which the Russians have used in order to focus on their quest for legally binding security guarantees. And that explains the rather surreal discussions that have just taken place in Geneva. Wendy Sherman went to those talks trying to get, again, the Russians to reduce their troop forces in Eastern Europe, to dismantle some of this infrastructure that they're building. And she came along with a whole flesh-creeping, or as the Americans hoped, flesh-creeping catalogue of sanctions threats that they would impose on Russia in the event that a conflict in Ukraine were to begin. And what Wendy Sherman predictably found was that the Russian negotiator, Sergei Ryabkov, was completely unimpressed and unfazed by these sanctions threats. He categorically refused any suggestion of Russia dismantling any part of the military infrastructure that Russia is building up in European Russia, and he pressed his demand for legally binding security guarantees. In response to that, Wendy Sherman had little to say. She came with a rag bag of proposals for non-deployment of missiles in Ukraine and for revivals of the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and all of that. But none of this seems to me to have been at all coherent, and certainly Ryabkov seems to have given it all short shrift. The result is 8 rather grueling hours of discussions in which nothing obviously was agreed, but in which the Russians were able to press their point about their demand for legally binding security guarantees. So the US has come away unable to get the Russians to budge on the steady build-up of military forces in European Russia, but with the Russians having successfully put the issue of their legally binding security guarantees on the agenda. They have also, as I discussed in a recent program we did on the Duran with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, in effect smoked the Americans out. They've now got the Americans and NATO to accept that there is a conflict in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine. The United States and NATO will not intervene militarily, and they've also forced disclosures or analyses in the United States that if sanctions were indeed imposed on Russia, in the form that Wendy Sherman threatened at this meeting in Geneva, it would have severe blowback on Europe and probably on the United States itself. That, I suspect, is something that the Russians have already figured out. And besides, as I have discussed already and in the past, I think the Russians have been carefully preparing for some time their positions so as to prepare for any possibility of sanctions. And I think that they're essentially ready for them. Anyway, there we are. A curious negotiation, not really a negotiation at all. The Americans coming, as I said, with no really clear plan, hoping somehow to get the Russians to draw down their forces in European Russia, forces which, as I said, were deployed there on the scale and in the quantity that they are, with the logistics infrastructure being built up there, largely because of this threat earlier last year to deploy by the Ukrainians to launch some kind of attack on the Donbass. And what has happened since then is that the United States now accepts and has publicly admitted that in the event of a war in the Donbass, a war which resulted in a Russian counter-response, Ukraine would be completely on its own and would be summarily defeated, and the United States has been forced to threaten sanctions instead, but at the same time it found that if it carried through with this sanctions threat, the sanctions would hurt primarily its own European allies and would cause economic blowback on itself. This has been a sorry picture, and if I may say, it's a classic example of what happens when a team of amateurs, in this case the Americans, people like Blinken and Sherman and Sullivan, come up against a team of professionals, people like Lavrov and Ryabkov and the rest. So that's, it seems to me, where we are. Now, there's not going to be any drawdown of Russian military forces in European Russia, but the Russians now have been in a position to make their demands, their underlying demands, clear. And as I've said, I suspect that from now on, seeing the tension, seeing the leverage, the tension military build-up in Eastern Europe gives them, they will be pressing forward with building up even further their military forces in European Russia, and of course bringing all these new fangled weapons, the Poseidon submarine drone, the Boris-Venik missile, the Armata tank, and all the rest into service. Now, somebody following my last program about this suggested to me that the actual Russian time frame is probably rather longer than I had thought, that it could actually be 5 years. And he made the point to me that in January last year, January 2021, Putin agreed to extend the New START treaty in a telephone call with Biden for 5 years. And 5 years is also the same period of time in which Putin and Xi Jinping extended the Russian-Chinese Friendship Treaty. Now, what that means is that the United States, in theory at least, can't exceed the military caps, the ceilings in nuclear strategic weapons, because it is still restricted by the terms of the New START treaty with Russia. But of course the Chinese, Russia's de facto ally, can build up their nuclear forces using that 5-year period in order to increase them significantly. And of course, during that same period, the Chinese will be able to build up, to accelerate their aircraft carrier building program, their naval build-up in the Pacific, just as the Russians are building up their own military forces in Europe and in the North Atlantic. And before very long, we're likely to see joint patrols between the Russians and the Chinese in Europe, in the North Atlantic in particular, just as we're already seeing joint patrols by the Chinese and the Russians in the Northeast Pacific. And at the same time, and perhaps even more pertinently, the Russians, within that 5-year period, will have completed their pipeline, their new Power of Siberia 2 pipeline to China, making them less dependent on gas supplies to Europe, putting them in a position, in fact, where they can switch gas round their country, move it from west to east and vice versa as the situation suits them. And also, of course, the Russians and the Chinese will no doubt use this 5-year period to develop the resilience of their financial systems to make them, in effect, impervious to sanctions. So what we're going to see, or so it seems to me, and I think this point about the 5-year period is actually a very good one. What we're going to see is a steady build-up of Russian and Chinese military power during that time. After the START treaty expires, unless there is some sort of a breakthrough on arms control issues, then we're going to see a major breakout by the Chinese and the Russians, who now we now know are sharing and developing military technologies together. And I would also suspect, and as my friend pointed out to me, it is highly likely that when that Chinese-Russian friendship treaty in 5 years' time comes up for renewal, it will be renewed in a way that probably includes military provisions. In other words, provisions even more consistent with these two countries becoming military allies. So that, it seems to me, is probably the game plan. I think this is reasonably right. I think this gives us some idea of the direction in which the Russians are heading. And I'm going to say something else. I suspect that from now on, in every discussion between the Americans and the Russians on strategic stability issues, on nuclear weapons limitations, on conventional force limitations, on every single issue, the Russians will be bringing up their demands for legally binding security guarantees. Now that this issue has been brought to the fore, the Russians will not give it up, and the Americans are going to find that they're not going to be able to make any progress with the Russians on any issue, even as the situation in the Pacific and in Europe deteriorates, unless and until they are prepared to sit down with the Russians and seriously address this issue of legally binding security guarantees. Now, what the United States is going to do in the face of this, I have no idea. It's not for me, perhaps, to speculate on American policies, especially given how volatile the situation in the United States has become. But I'm going to say one thing, which is that this mantra that we're now hearing, that the United States cannot and will not ever give up on the principle of open-ended expansion of NATO, that is not a policy. It is not even a negotiating position. It is a pose. The Russians, in what they are saying, they're making points about security. The Americans are not making even points of principle, because there is actually no principle at stake issue. They're making a point of dogma. They're saying that we have a right to expand NATO without limit, and that's it, and we're not prepared to negotiate about that. That is not a sustainable negotiating position. Certainly not with a party that is becoming equivalent to the United States in military power. And here I'm not just talking about Russia, I'm talking about the Russian-Chinese military alliance system. So sooner or later, I suspect the reality is going to dawn. To reiterate again, the United States is not prepared to fight for Ukraine or for Georgia or for any other country that is not a member of NATO and which is a member of the former Soviet Union. The Russians are. The Russians have made it clear that they will fight if any step is taken to bring these countries into NATO. Given that that is so, these countries will not be brought into NATO. That issue no longer exists. So given that this is so, it is barely conceivable to me, even allowing for the kind of irrational making of policy that you see in the United States, that the United States is going to allow its military position, its security, to incrementally deteriorate over the next few years, over what is essentially, at best, a dogma, at worst, a rhetorical pose. At some point, it will crumble and we will see some kind of binding treaty or at least legal agreement start to crystallize. But we have a long way to go before we get there. The Americans, as I said, find it very difficult to retreat from these rhetorical positions they have taken. We shall see where we go. Well, I think I've summarized the position adequately. Please join us on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also join us on our various other platforms, Locals especially, where we do an extensive amount of exclusive content. Please remember that I do live streams on Locals every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1900 hours London time. You can join me there if you join us on Locals. We're present on a multiplicity of other platforms as well: BitChute, Library, Rumble, ODYSEE, SuperU. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Please also, if you like this video, remember to press the like button. Please also remember to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's all from me today. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a very good day.